Thanks everyone for joining us at the Project Censored Radio Show. I'm your co-host Eleanor Goldfield along with Mickey Huff. We're very glad right now to be joined by Mike Elk, who's the Emmy-nominated founder of Payday Report. He also works as a correspondent for the leading Brazilian magazine Revista Forum and previously served as a correspondent for The Guardian. Mike, thanks so much for joining us.
So great to join today. I'm such a huge fan of Project Censored and all the work Yins do,
Oh,
bringing
well,
like many stories that the media doesn't cover.
absolutely. And that is one of the reasons that we're a big fan of yours, not least of all the story that we're about to talk about today. And folks can go over to paydayreport.com if you want to check that out. And I definitely recommend that you do, because it is something that you won't be able to see on corporate media. So on Monday, February 3rd, a day without immigrants strikes were held in at least 120 cities across 40 states and Puerto Rico, according to the strike tracking analysis by Payday Report. Um, so Mike, I want to start with this and say, like, that sounds to me like something that legacy media would pick up on. Since they didn't, I want to ask you if you could tell us a little bit about the scope of these strikes, some examples of what they looked like, and this absolute failure by corporate media to pick up on something this huge.
Well, I think there's a huge problem here. I mean, one, labor issues are undercovered, and then two, communities of color are certainly undercovered, no matter where they are. And when you get into the language barriers, or not just language barriers, but social barriers, immigrant communities are even more undercovered. So this is a huge issue. We've been doing this strike tracking for a couple years now at Payday Report. We've tried different upswings, et cetera. And, we went out and we just did a simplistic search last Monday, and we found strikes in 120 cities in 40 states. Some of these strikes, like here in Pittsburgh, involved a few dozen businesses. Some of them in places like LA involved hundreds of businesses, perhaps thousands, according to some estimates. There's no clear number. We only could find that there were 140 cities. And then some of them were in small towns like Oak Ridge, North Carolina, where a local bar owner closed his business for the day because he didn't want to, he valued his workers. Or in Winchester, Virginia, which is an area where there's a huge growth in the immigrant population because of the meatpacking facilities. So the places where we saw these strikes, and no, we found them in at least 40 states. We couldn't find them in some areas that are news deserts. So we imagine that there's a lot more, and that there's a lot more that just simply didn't get brought to the attention of anyone. That may have slipped through the cracks. We're a small operation of 1.5 people. Um, so, for us to find out this information and for the rest of the mainstream media to miss it is a big deal. And I wouldn't say it's just the mainstream media. I would also say it's the left media. I think the left has particularly, if you look at the left press, right, most of these jobs in the left press are very poorly paid. Uh, if most of the people I know who wind up making it in the left press make it one of three ways. They either have a parent who's wealthy, they have a partner, a romantic partner who makes a lot more money, a spouse or something like that. Or then they have, or the third way, which often happens, is they're a superstar. They have hundreds of thousands of followers. And if, and they don't really question the management practices. And so, during the George Floyd protests, we did a similar strike tracking where we found there were over 600 strikes in 1 month. That's just what we could track, right? Obviously, there were a lot we couldn't. Um, and there were articles written in labor notes and elsewhere that these aren't real strikes, that, I think this guy, Chris Brooks, who's now the chief of staff of the UAW, was saying, you can't organize around race issues because corporations can co-opt them. Well, that's something that's being said from a position of white privilege. And maybe the UAW should wonder why they've lost so much in the South if they have someone saying you can't organize around race issues. But this is a big issue that the left press has as well, in that it's very, very white. Um, you know, that it's, very underpaid. And that typically when people cover stories in the left press, the economies, they're looking for things that are quick hits. There's going to be a strike here, a protest here. I called the PR person. The PR person lined up the interviews. I can do this real quick and then do the other 10,000 side hustles I have to do this week to get paid, which is the reality of the press. Um, and so our project, and as well as what Project Censored does, gets to how do we rebuild that relationship between activists and readers? How do we get people to bring in information and start covering these things? Because, you know, this was just one of the first strikes that was called on a few days' notice, right? By the immigrant community. It was in some areas led by online groups. And I think in some ways the left is uncomfortable with these strikes because they involve a lot of small business owners closing. Now, some people would say, well, this isn't a true strike because, oh, small business owners are aligning with, and immigrant communities are aligning with, uh, workers to do something. That's, you're getting your power from the boss. I mean, that's a very Marxian way to look at it. But if you looked at, we had one example from Central Washington, from a apple picking region in Central Washington, where, there was a call for a day without immigrants in a heavily immigrant community. And there was a good article in the Wachachi paper. It's in our story. I can't. It's something with a W. But there was the Winnetchat Valley um, paper, and there was an article where local business owners were saying, well, we don't know if we should close, but we fear if we don't, we'll get boycotted. So, who at the end of the day is calling these strikes? Of course, they have some support in the small business community. These are political strikes, which we too all don't often have in the US, and we need to have right now. And we need to form those alliances. No one's saying that, look, Google, Ford, any of these big companies, I wouldn't trust them. But look, I'm technically a small business owner. I paid out 30,000 in freelance work last year, right? Am I not part of the working class? I mean, I'm struggling to pay my light bill. I'm struggling to pay my healthcare bill. And so we really, the stuff that we've talked about so far to stop the Trump administration has been primarily, holding vigils, as I'd like to say. We're going to go hold a rally and, we're going to put out this petition. Doesn't get you for very far. Maybe on a few of the real deep outrages, it can get you a little bit here and there. Every once in a while, someone feels embarrassed about something, right? That's not a good strategy for winning, the hoping, oh, maybe the boss will see the rally and, one time out of 20, we'll get a reversal. I mean, that's a losing strategy.
Or you'll just get fired. I mean, I used to call, or I still do. I call permanent marches parades because if you're asking permission to walk down the street with a sign that no one in power cares that you're holding, it's not a march, it's a parade. And that's fine. Like these parades can be a nice catharsis. They can be a nice time to link up with friends and things like that. But if we're looking at it from a tactical perspective, it doesn't shift anything in terms of the power structure. And I think that tactically we have to look at that. And of course, strikes historically have been where we, the little people, have that most power with holding our labor. And I think like what you're talking about with this, oh, we're going to argue about whether it's called a strike or not. It feels like the saying, when the left has meetings, we sit in a circle. That's also how we do our firing ranges. It seems like this totally pointless endeavor of arguing about, oh, the semantics of the situation. It's like, hey, while we're arguing about the semantics, like people are dying, they're being thrown in cages, they're being fired, they're terrified of going out their door because of ICE raids. So I think that this also speaks to some of that like purity testing that goes on, which of course the internet is great for, and I highly recommend that people get into more Twitter fights. um, but but I
Well,
think
the people doing the purity testing are always the whitest people who ignore the people of color, in my experience.
that
It's
is
this, like,
often.
we have all this own guilt, and I'm not saying I'm not a class reductionist or anything like that, but I do think that you deal with these guilt games sometimes when you're dealing with a very privileged white background of most of the left press. These guilt games, as opposed to like, how about you just go out and form real bonds of solidarity?
Because it's hard.
Hard.
um,
I can sit here on Twitter and gain followers, and why
yeah.
even have this conversation with you here? I could be tweeting.
Yeah, I
Who's
know. I mean, you should be. But I want to also ask you if you kind of on that same note, if in these strikes that y'all saw and were covering, were they majority strikes and that were called for or organized by immigrant communities themselves, or was there kind of an active solidarity by people who had the privilege, documented folks like myself, that have the privilege of going out there and calling for these? Did you see anything like that, or was it typically the immigrants themselves who were calling for these and organizing them and doing all the legwork?
I think it was a combination of things. I think it was immigrants. I mean, certainly here in Pittsburgh, we had some businesses closed that were white-owned that weren't in immigrant communities. It also was strategic. They held it on a Monday, which is the day a lot of restaurants are closed, which is good. But you have to be creative about these things. And so, it is a mixture of folks that have no real um, leverage. I mean, look, if you're an immigrant working in a restaurant right now, I'd be scared shitless. If you're working in a Latino restaurant right now, that, there could be some vigilantes, there could be some ICE folks that show up. You got a target on your back, you know? I mean, maybe if you're working on a construction site, some residential property out in the suburbs where nobody might know you're there, you might feel a little safer. But if you're in a big meat packing plant that's majority Latino, if you're out in a farm field that's heavily immigrant, if you're in a Latino restaurant or most restaurants in most parts of the country, you got a target on your back. So at which point, and I have some friends that are undocumented. Do you say to yourself, I'm not going to live in fear, you know? And that's a big question. I'm not going to live in fear. Uh, you know, I've lived in situations of fear. I was in combat zones as a reporter, and at a certain point, you just say, "Fuck it." The tension of staying is so heavy, and if they're going to get you anyhow, you might as well fight. You might as well do it. I mean, and so I do think it's a combination of people that are taking very big risks, but at the same time, they're taking a very big risk by doing nothing and going silently. It's I've had family members who died in the Holocaust, and it's something like that. Like, do you just hope if you passively go along, you make it out, or if you go to a protest, or if you simply tell people to shut it down? I mean, because that's the beauty of having small business owners give some cover, is that and so there's alliances there. And I think, during the George Floyd protest, there was all, Labor Notes wrote these articles about, these aren't real strikes, because they have this Marxian view and a lack of understanding of political strikes. But, I've worked extensively in Brazil. I've been involved in political strikes. I mean, not organizing, but covering them. Um, and they work in a very different manner. And I think what was interesting about this strike was it was the first national attempt, right? Where people were blown away. Here in Pittsburgh, they did it on 2 or 3 days' notice. And yeah, the Pittsburgh Hispanic Development Corporation did help put on that strike. In California, the San Francisco Latino Chamber of Commerce helped put on those strikes. Those were allies.
And I want to talk a little bit about these strikes and what they represent in terms of the a day without immigrants, the whole idea. And I'm pulling right now from 2022 numbers, so these are not up to date, but there are roughly 8.3 million so-called unauthorized immigrants in the US workforce. States like Texas, Florida, and California rely heavily on this labor. So in Nevada, for instance, 9% of the workforce are so-called unauthorized immigrants, Texas 8%, Florida 8%. Um, and again, this is just so-called unauthorized immigrants. So this isn't all immigrants. And if these millions of people were just suddenly disappeared from the workforce, the US economy would fall apart. I mean, it's already on shaky legs. Not least of all because these are workers that are actually in sectors that help us survive, like farming and transportation. So Mike, can you paint us a picture here? I think a lot of people see news about strikes or something and they can't, it's hard to like put it together. Like, what does this mean in real life? Like, if these people were just disappeared from the workforce, what would that do to the rest of us, so to speak? This kind of build us that bridge for solidarity.
Well, first off, I mean, part of the reason, you're seeing a lot of employers protest these immigration measures. You're seeing agriculture employers, you're seeing meatpacking houses, you're seeing other employers step up and say, "Hey, this is our workforce," and unfortunately, they enjoy them because they exploit low wages. But we're also in a historic labor shortage right now, historic labor shortage, and there's just certain regions of the country where you couldn't get workers for anything really. Um, so, if without having these folks in the workforce, I mean, I mean, we lose our sense of multiculturalism. We lose our sense of being a country that welcomes people. We lose our sense of being a country that, I've lived and worked in Brazil off and on over the years for several decades now. And we're still respected in those countries despite all our crazy stuff. Our culture is still king somehow because of that notion that we had for so many years of the American dream and that anyone can come here. And obviously, over the last 30, 40 years, that image has changed a lot, unfortunately. Uh, even from where we were in the 1980s when, Reagan gave amnesty to immigrants. So if you really look what happened with the crackdown on immigration, it was really something that went into full force in the 90s and the 2000s. And even if you look at where we are in this debate compared to where we were during the Obama administration, we're trying to get dreamers, or under the Bush administration, where, you know, uh, some people would probably take the deal that the Bush administration had on the table, which people saw as punitive at the time, right? And it's important to note that in 2006, when they tried to pass that legislation, over 1 million immigrants walked out on May Day. So, we're at this point where our country is losing a lot of a sense of itself and what makes us vibrant. It's not boring white people from, that are bigoted. It's having Hollywood is Hollywood because around the world, because of it presenting multicultural images of this country that don't always exist in other countries around the world, that people don't have the freedom to say in other countries. And we're losing a sense of that, you know. I mean, even if you compare us to some of these European countries like Germany and France that have horrific violence against immigrants. If you look at Germany, right, you can be born in a Turkish family in Germany and never become a citizen. You look at France, they outlawed wearing hijabs there, right? So there are still, I think, values of this country that we're losing. And obviously, there's an economic effect. There's a huge effect on families. But what does it mean about who we are? And I think, and this is another problem with media, is we don't have a lot of foreign reporting anymore. We have no sense of how people outside of here. I mean, I go down to Brazil a couple times a year for a month or two every year. And I wish every American did that just so they knew how people overseas thought of us. It's a mixture of love and hate, particularly in a place like Brazil, which is heavily Italian and German and African descendants. Um, but even if you go to other countries and other parts of the world, we've really lost that sense of ourselves over the last 30 years, I would say, you know, starting around the Persian Gulf War, really. There was this feeling, oh, the Cold War's over, everything's going to be great. And we've just demonized and demonized. And I think the one thing really holding it back is having a multicultural media system. And which is why I find that the work and the support you guys give to small publications like ours is so important. Because we do know that these stories can break through. During the 2020 pandemic strikes, we tracked over 3,000 strikes. We were the first publication to quantitatively track the strike wave and were cited by the Washington Post. Pulitzer Prize winner Greg Jaffe described us as being ahead of the curve. Um, and we were widely picked up. We broke through the media. Uh, but I think we're in a different moment than the pandemic. I think so many people, and when I used to be single, I would deal with this. I'd go out on dates with women that would say, "Ah, I don't like to read the news that much. It's just so stressful. I want to go to my yoga class and watch TV and mindless TV and just not think about it because I feel so many people feel overwhelmed because they're not seeing ways that they can get involved. I mean, going to these parades, as you call them, doesn't really lead to direct action necessarily. And I think we need to be paying a lot more attention to these strikes because this is just the beginning of them. There's going to be a huge one on May 1st, probably several million people we're looking at. Um, and I think I think we need to continue building.
Yeah, absolutely. And I hope that there's a big a big walkout on May 1st. It is, after all, May Day, and it comes from Haymarket, so a history that has been buried on purpose. Um, I wanted to. We only have a few minutes left, but I wanted to ask you also about the how unions play a role here, and because I think a lot of people think of these as disparate issues, like, oh, unions are one thing over here, and then immigrants are over here. But how would you say that unions could protect against these raids, these ICE raids, or these mass deportations and things like that?
Well, some unions do have very good plans. For instance, I was just at a meeting of the American Federation of Teachers. ICE tried to show up to a school in Chicago, and the support staff and the school resource officers would not allow ICE to enter the building. They locked it down. And that was something they negotiated in their contracts. So you can get that in union contracts that ICE is not allowed in the facility. And oftentimes, when ICE tries to do these raids, they don't have real warrants. They have what's called an administrative warrant. It's not signed by a judge. And everyone should do a Know Your Rights. Some unions are doing Know Your Rights trainings. Uh, Obviously, it'd be better to see more, but we are seeing a lot of unions engage on this issue. Particularly when you look at, like, if you look at like the Teamsters, they're third Latino. Majority of the labor movement will be people of color by 2030, 5 years. So, you know, you have to see engagement there because now having Trump in office, I mean, every workplace, any major construction site, any major meatpacking facility, any warehouse is going to have undocumented workers. And if, management can pull this card to just call ICE, it's hard. And so we are seeing some engagement. I think we need to start seeing, we need to start covering that more. And we're a small publication. We put out a newsletter 3 times a week. We put out 1 or 2 articles a week. We do some podcasts here and there. But we rely on reader funding. And if anyone wants to donate, then go to our site, paydayreport.com /donate. We certainly appreciate it. Sign up as a recurring donor. But we don't, even in our space, right? I started reading Project Censored during the lead up to the war in Iraq in the war 2000, early 2000s. And it was mind blowing to me reading Project Censored at the time, being a college student, right? And there was a real movement, I think, pre social media of like, how do we create our own blogs? Oh, we can do our own little websites, tompayne.com, Alternet, Project Censored, Bill Moyers, all these sites, right? We can, oh, you don't need a subscription to the Nation anymore. You can just go read it. There was Daily Cost, there was MyDD, there was Open Left, there were all these sites, and people with the comment sections. I was describing to an activist 10 years younger to me how in depth the discussions used to be in the comment sections, and then I think in the late 2000s, early 2010s, social media came along. So instead of having this sort of unions and NGOs and foundations pumping money into the blogosphere, what we had instead was unions, uh, uh, you know, people just saying, "Hey, we're just going to invest in our own social media." And look where that took us with Twitter. I used to have 22,000 followers on Twitter. Elon Musk came along, I lost 4,000, but then everyone sort of stopped using Twitter. I mean, people are going to Blue Sky now, which I like a lot better. But the capitalists took over Twitter and they played with the algorithms to keep people like us out. You know, I mean, they make it on Twitter. I don't think most people realize this, that if you post a link, it puts you down in the algorithm because they don't want people leaving Twitter to go to another site. So you'll see now, and it's disturbing. It pisses me off. I'll see activists just post the screenshot of the headline as if the whole story doesn't matter any, right? Because of that issue with the links. And then just, if you're not the superstar who's going to drive a ton of traffic. And what I like about Blue Sky, and we've only been on there 3 months, and we've picked up a lot of followers. Folks can follow us at Mike Elk, is that it's not an algorithm. It's chronological. And you can create lists. This is my A list, this is my B list, this is, people I'm going to check. But your post gets the same uplift of anyone else who's in the feed. And I like that. And I like what Blue Sky is doing. I think it's good, but it's not going to solve stuff. And I think what's going to solve stuff is building. And we're starting to see this with the newsletter movement. I would describe us as a newsletter. I say newsletter in the sense that it might be an operation with one or two, maybe three people. We dream someday to grow into a big outlet. With the newsletter movement, we're seeing more people move back to that. We're starting to see some ripples. I mean, people want good news. I mean, look, I meet news junkies all the time. I don't mean to say junkie in a bad way, but I meet news addicts. Oh, there I went again. But anyhow, I meet news hounds all the time that love to read good news, and I think we're losing that, and I think we have to get that back. And I think that really requires some deep movement conversation because otherwise, strikes like these immigrants' rights strikes aren't going to get covered.
It's very true. Yeah. Well, folks, check out paydayreport.com to read this piece and to check out the strike map. That's paydayreport.com. Mike, thanks so much for coming on the show, and really appreciate the work that you do bringing all of these this labor news to light.
Well, thank you.